Okay, so let's do some code. Today's lecture is about Rails as an API. So we're actually gonna leave JavaScript land a little bit, and we're gonna dive back into Rails. Not exactly the same way that we're using it before, but very similar. So what we're going to be building today is and you might think to yourself, like, this is not possible. I don't know how to do this, but we're actually going to be building an API today. Yes, you can do it. We'll learn how to do it. So we're going to build an API with Rails. It's super easy, actually, to kind of get started. And we're gonna hook up our API to our front end, where I actually already have a front end, so we're not gonna be building out too much there. Depending on the time, if we still have time, if you wanna go through the front end, we can take a look at that code, but we're mostly gonna be spending time in the back end. All right, so I already have my front end up right here, and we have a folder called front end. And we're going to create a folder called backend for our Rails backend. And the way that we're going to build our Rails backend, or the way that our front end and our backend are going to communicate to each other, is via fetch requests, right? So you've done this a whole lot already. You have run the JSON server that kind of acted as your backend, right? Now we're going to build out an actual full backend. And we're going to communicate via fetch requests by sending back and forth JSON data. Can someone do a quick recap of why JSON is cool and why do we care to use it?
My favorite thing about it is readability.
Multiple languages.
Yeah, Tisdale, could you repeat that also? Nathan, thank you. That was right.
My favorite thing about it is readability.
Okay.
I like it because it makes information a lot easier to parse through.
Also, the multiple language can use JSON data in multiple language.
Absolutely. All correct. Thank you. Thanks, everyone. JSON is language agnostic. So just like you all said, we can use it to communicate from one language to the other. So if we send information from Rails to JavaScript, we know how to parse that and turn that into an object or an array in JavaScript, and the other way around. So that is why JSON is so cool. Does someone know, just random fact, what we used before we had JSON?
Was it XML?
XML.
Yes, XML. That's why the requests that we're making are actually called XML HTTP requests. They should technically be called JSON HTTP requests nowadays, but we're not going to rename that, so that's going to stick around. But yeah, XML, if you're interested, XML looks a whole lot like HTML, and it used to be the way a lot of APIs still, or some APIs still use it. Used to be the way how we format data so that we can send it to different, share it from one language to another language. All right, but we're going to stick with JSON, and in fact, most APIs nowadays use JSON as a format. Okay, so we are going to let's see, did we want to talk about this? Yeah, let's do it. Request response cycle. What is the request response cycle, and how does that translate to what we're doing with our front end and our back end? Or just what's the request response cycle?
It's a modular code that sends a request, that basically has the URL that it's requesting from, the type of request, and then some information about the request, either, information it's sending or information it wants back. And then the response is from the external object with similar data, just the response to the request.
Yeah, so it's pretty much like the way that we communicate from our front end to our back end. Our front end sends a request to our back end. Our back end sends a response, and we can send data within these requests and responses. We can send an additional information, but it's pretty much just like making having a client and a server communicate to each other. Cool. What about, let's do one last piece of review here. What about REST? What's a RESTful API, and why do we care to use it?
A standardized way to kind of arrange your URLs so that if you're using different websites, it's easy to kind of understand what's going on both as a coder and then as a end user.
Yeah, exactly. It's essentially just like a set of rules that we use in order to build our own API, or if we're using an API and it says that it's RESTful, we pretty much know exactly like what endpoints we need to hit in order to get certain pieces of information. So it's just some of these rules that we follow here. Okay, so what we're going to do now is we're going to actually create our backend. We're going to create our Rails backend, and our Rails backend is going to only act as an API. So the one thing that's going to be different, and let me actually get this started, and then I can keep talking. So we are in our main folder here. So I'm going to create a new Rails application. So I'm going to say Rails new, and I'm going to call it just like backend. And then I'm going to add a flag here. Dash dash is always called a flag, right? Dash dash API. Now, one other thing that I could do, and I've done this previously, so you can kind of see that here, is I add another flag here for setting the particular database that I want to use. We don't have to do that. I'm probably not going to do that right now, but once you get to building your project, I would definitely recommend using the Postgres database, because that means that you're going to have a much easier time hosting your project later on. So it's cool that this is just super easy to do with Rails, because you can just simply add the flag, and all of the setup will be done for you. But for now, we're going to stick with just like Rails new. This is just my auto formatting here that's doing that. Sorry about that. There we go. Rails new, and then I'm going to give this a name. I'm going to call it backend because I got my front end here, and then dash dash API. So once I run this, a couple of things happen. Essentially, like a project is being created for me, just like it was previously with when we said Rails new without the flag. But it's a little bit different because a few things aren't created for us, or essentially what's being created is like a slimmed down version of a Rails application. Because so if we use Rails as an API, what is the one thing that we do not need Rails to do for us anymore?
Render views.
Yes, exactly. So remember, we have our like model view controller pattern that we usually follow in Rails. We're not going to need the V of that anymore. We're not going to need our views, because now our front end, our JavaScript, our HTML will take care of that part. Our front end will essentially be the V of our MVC. We will still have our models. We will still have our controllers in Rails. We will still have routes. All of that stays the same, but we are not going to need the views anymore. So if we kind of look through our backend folder structure here, it looks pretty much the same as like what we've seen before. A couple of differences here in, again, our views folder. We're not really going to need that anymore. We're not going to use that. in addition to that, let's take a look at our controller here. We are in our controller, and let's take a look at our model. No, what am I looking for? Yeah, our controllers. We're not inheriting from Action Controller base anymore, but instead we're inheriting from Action Controller API. And a lot of these changes and a lot of the things that are different are related, are in order to make this application more of like only relevant for like being used as an API. So a lot of the things that we previously had with a normal Rails application, we don't need anymore. So we're essentially running like a slimmed down version that will enable us to build an API with it. And that is pretty much it. We're gonna start like building out some of our models, some of our controllers, but in order to create this project, that's really all we need to do is run this one command. Any questions here so far? Okay. All right. So our the domain that we're going to use is we have this like Zookeeper application. Is we're going to have animals and we're going to have species. So an animal is going to belong to a species, and a species will have many animals. So we got a simple has many belongs to relationship, and let's go ahead and set that up. So I'm going to actually close the front end here. All I've done with the front end so far is open index.html. And let's go ahead and close this, and we'll stick with our backend terminal here. Okay, so to get started, let's create a model. Someone remember how to create a model with a generator?
Rails G model.
Rails G model. And this is going to be, let's do species. And the species is just going to have a name. We're going to keep it super simple just to get that like basic functionality working. And I should be in my backend folder in order to do that. Don't forget about that. Don't make the mistakes that I'm making. All right, let's see. Not sure if we need to worry about this at this point. Let's take a look at our model. We got our model here created for us. Already inheriting correctly. That's, that's how you know your Rails generators. It's all created automatically. And we're going to do the same thing with our animal. So we're going to Rails generate animal. Rails generate model animal. And an animal is going to have a name, gender, and a species, and a relationship to our species. Remember that an animal belongs to a species. So if we run this and look at our animal class, we can see that we already have our belongs to macro in here. Remember, if you're running that, you have to still implement the inverse in your other model. So in your species model, we have to add has many animals. All right. And at this point, we can do what? What do we want to do? Sorry. What's the one thing we still need to do?
Migrate and seed.
Exactly. Check out our migrations. They look good. Let's go ahead and Rails DB migrate. And here we go. Awesome. Let's take a look at our schema real quick. Looks like all of our relationships are there. Happy with that. Yes, we should probably seed also. I think I have some seeds over here that I can copy so we don't have to type that out. So let me go ahead and paste that in here. Cool, we got some species, we got some animals. And let's do a seed here. Awesome. At this point, we can always see if things are working correctly by running our console, checking out our animals, checking out our species, figuring out if the relationships are set up correctly. So if we have, let's see, species dot first dot animals, we are getting the relationship. It looks like everything's going fine. Okay, so from here, we want to create some controllers. Before we do that, are there any questions so far?
The format you just had in the terminal, you did take species.all and animal.all. That was a JSON format, right? Or is that something your terminal is just doing for
that is, yeah, so that's actually just a hash, an array. Let's see, species.all. It's just an array of hashes. I have something, I forget what this is called. I installed something at some point that will kind of format it a little bit nicer so that I can read it. But that was a while ago. I really don't remember. I'm also in the fish shell, not in the other one. ZSH. So I'm sure that in whatever shell you're in, you can get something like this that kind of formats the output a little nicer.
Okay, I just wanted to make sure I didn't miss somewhere you had said this is supposed to be like JSON format, so that makes sense then.
Yeah, for sure. No, we'll get to that part actually. So, okay, so let's now create some of our controllers. We only need 2, so let's create a controller for our animal, and we are going to create a controller for a species. Let's do the same thing for species. And let's go ahead and check those out. And they look good. Nothing in them, but we're going to fix that in just a second. All right, so everything so far, pretty much what you have been doing, right? Nothing too different besides the API flag. Relationships still work the same, controllers still work the same. I want to take a little bit of a sidestep here in order to set up our file folder structure correctly for using for creating an API. This is 100% not necessary. I'm just showing you like a good practice, good convention that you should follow. But we could actually kind of just take what we have right now and just keep building our API. But what I want to do instead is I want to go to my routes, and we have to add routes anywhere, right? We'll add like resources for our animals, and then the same thing for our species. Cool. So we would do this anyway. But the one thing that we're going to do a little bit differently is we're going to namespace our resources. And again, this is not necessary in order to make your backend API functional, but it is recommended to add a little bit of namespacing logic here. And I will show you what that does and why we do this. So we're going to create a namespace here, an API namespace. And then around that, or inside of that, we're actually going to create another namespace. That is for our V1. And we're going to put all of these resources inside. And so can someone maybe guess like why? So first of all, like what this will create is something like we're going to hit our like localhost 3000, right? /API/v1/animals, for instance. This might be one of our URLs. Why do you think that we care about adding this extra namespace here? It really just like adds more to what we have to think about later on, right? Why might this be useful?
Just to take a guess at it, API tells, differentiates it from the rest of what you might be using your domain for. So if you ever needed to actually use domain/animals, for something to actually display something to a user, you still have it available as a route.
Yeah.
And it's just more specific because this is just specific to API. And then V1, I'm guessing, is like, so you don't accidentally like destroy anybody that's depending on your API. So like if later some, you know, Carl format comes out and everyone's using that, but people are still using JSON, you can just move that to V2 or something like that.
Exactly. Exactly right on all accounts. We are, so first of all, we're trying to differentiate between this being like an API and say we were, in this case, we're not, but we were using the domain to display other things. We might actually be using the Rails, like Rails as a front end as well for some reason. So we're just trying to say like, okay, this is the API part of our application. And then exactly right with the V1, if we serve this application, if we say, hey, anybody can use this API that I built, once people start using it, you don't want to make any breaking changes, right? Because at that point, whoever's using your API, it's probably going to break their site if you make a huge change. So in order to kind of account for that, you add these version numbers. So we have our V1. Say we made some big changes, we would just go ahead and add a V2, right? Easy enough. We'll let the users know, hey, there's a V2 of our API. You'll see this a whole lot. Feel free to like migrate to it. These are the changes that we've made, but it won't break anything about the code that you've already written because we still have our V1. So that is the reason that we want to namespace our resources. Again, it is not actually necessary in order to make this a functional API. Any questions about that?
In that case, would you need some, if you did implement a V2, in this case, you need like a different controller or some kind of handling on your controller? Obviously we don't need to get into how to do that, but
no, that's a great question. Well, there's actually more work that we have to do in order to make this structure like set up correctly. And one of the things that we need to do is we need to create some folders here. So our controllers are going to sit inside of our API v1 folders. Our
awesome.
Animal controller, and then our species controller. You need to do this if you namespace your routes like that in order for Rails to recognize this. So then you just have a v2 folder at that point.
Great.
Okay, so from here, one more thing that we need to do in order to set this up is we need to make sure that we also namespace our classes. So if we have our controller inside of an API folder inside of a v1 folder, or the other way around, then we need to make sure that we namespace our class here. So we say API v1 and then animal controller. We'll do the same thing for our other controller. And that way, Rails is happy. We have everything set up according to Rails conventions. And from there, we can just kind of move on just like we would previously. Okay, so again, let's recap this one more time. There's no reason that you need to do this. I just recommend that you do it. We namespaced our routes here inside of an API namespace and then a v1 namespace, which will create an endpoint, looking something like this for all of our animals. And then inside of our controllers, we made sure that we created an API folder, inside of that a v1 folder, and then we namespaced our controllers as well so that Rails can find them. And that is it. That's everything we need to do in order to get our namespacing working. Any questions here?
Two things, and again, kind of side questions. In the case of namespacing these this API, would you ever have it so that you have like two different Rails applications, one that's your API and one's that you're maybe serving some stuff to your front end, and then route different domains to them? Or like a subdomain to one, and then like you could route an API dot, amelierocks.com to the API Rails app, and then the regular domain would just go to a different app? Or is that even like it's kind of the vision that just popped into my head. I'm not even sure if that's like.
You mean if you wanted to if you wanted to like build a Rails front end as well in addition to the
Yeah.
API?
Yeah.
So you can actually do that within this application if you wanted to, right? If we had normal views, and so one thing that we could do, and this kind of falls into coding out our controllers. I think this is in our README as well, is we can serve different types of responses based on the request that someone is making. So
Awesome.
say, right, we want to render HTML as opposed to JSON. That is when we serve a different response. So in that case, you might actually have, like the Rails part front end in that same application.
Cool. Okay.
Cool. We're not actually gonna like utilize this, but that's something that you can do. Was that, does that answer your question?
It does. Yeah, thank you.
Okay.
I'm starting to I'm thinking about things that probably aren't even really important right now because that's how my brain works.
All good. All right, so let's fill out our controller. At this point, we just have our routes, and we should probably also, maybe once we know what kind of routes we're gonna hit, we should narrow down our routes a little bit. So maybe we want to add like a, only kind of exception here so that we don't expose all of our routes at once. But we can take care of that later. So in our animals controller, we're actually not gonna worry too much about our species controller. We're just gonna figure out how to build out one of these controllers. The other one would look really similar. Our end goal is to be able to like create a new animal, persist that in our Rails backend, and be able to fetch all of our animals and so on. Okay, so if I want an endpoint to fetch all of my animals, what action would I have to create here in my controller?
Or index.
Index, exactly. And up until here, so what we would probably do usually, right? Say like @animals equals animal.all, right? And at that point, like we would be pretty much done here in our controller. Like we could just go into our views. Since we're not using any views, since we're not using the V of the MVC in Rails, but that's going to be our JavaScript part, we are not actually gonna, so normally what we do here, or what's implicit, is we render like an index page. We generally don't have to explicitly say that, but it's always implicit. What we want to do instead of rendering our index page here is we want to render JSON. And we're going to say, what do we want to render for our @animals? So we're essentially telling Rails, whenever you get a request to this index action, go ahead and send back JSON data and send back the list of animals that we have. One other thing that we can do here to improve our code a little bit and to minimize the scope that we're using is, since we're not using views anymore, get rid of your @sign, right? We usually do that in order to pass information to our views. At this point, we don't need to do that. We don't need to pass anything to our views. We're just going to render a JSON in our response, and that is it. Any questions here about the syntax? We'll try that out in just a second. All right, let's start our server. So I'm going to do Rails S, and then we're going to go to localhost 3000, and we are on Rails, and we're going to go to, what is it, animals, API, right? v1/animals. Here, I have it already. Okay, let's see. Did I do something wrong here? Oh, animals. Forgot the S. That would help. Animals controller. Does that look good? Cool. Okay, here we go. All right, so we made a request to our Rails backend to API v1/animals that should give us back all of our animals. We are then hitting our index action here. It grabs all of our animals from our database and renders JSON data back to, sends JSON data back to where we requested it from. And here are all of our animals. This is the first part to like creating our API. So it's already pretty cool. I want to show you a different way of how you can access this type of data. This is a lot of times something that you want to do whenever you're creating like a backend and a frontend, is test out your backend first before you build out a bunch of fetch requests in the front end. You can obviously test the backend like by making fetch requests from the front end, but a lot of times you want to see if your relationships are working and if you're getting the correct response without having to build out the entire front end part. So one other tool that we can use is either something like Insomnia or Postman, if you've heard of that. I think Postman you should have heard of that. Insomnia is pretty much the same thing. They are tools. It's a piece of software that you can download that will help you make requests to anywhere, right? In our case, we're going to make a request to our local host. Let's actually try this out. So we're going to say localhost v1 API v1 animals, right? And we can specify what kind of request we want to make: get request, post request, patch, so on. We're going to just make a get request here. We're going to send this, and here's the same response that we just got in our browser. Not super impressive yet, but once we want to test out of post requests and our delete requests and all of those requests that we can't simply like see when we go to an endpoint in our, that's not just a simple get request, at that point it is super useful to use a tool like this that will enable you to test out these kinds of requests. Again, Postman or Insomnia, you should be able to find them if you type in Postman. Should be able to get something for Mac or whatever you're on. See, Postman client, I believe that's it. I'm sure there's a download button here somewhere. Well, if someone can find it, maybe post it. The other one is Insomnia. That is another, let's see, Insomnia HTTP request. Let's see if we can find it. Here we go. I personally like Insomnia because I like so it would be Insomnia Core here, not the designer one. I like the layout and I like the functionality of it, but they do pretty much the same thing. Okay, yeah.
I have a quick question, and I'm sorry if you covered this already.
Go for it.
When you use the API and then the V1, like all that stuff, like how it goes into its own like subfolder inside of controllers, is there like a specific reason that you would use that versus not using it?
Yeah, so this is really just for like convention in order to make your first of all, like make your API seem a little more legit if you're actually want to send it out for people to use. And like we talked about earlier, like the API part signifies that this is the API part of the application. The V1 part tells the user that this is the first version. If we want to make changes, we create a V2. It is not actually necessary in order to make our API functional, but it is just a good rule to follow. That's pretty much it.
Great, thank you.
Cool, no problem. Any other questions at this point? Okay, let's build out a little bit more of our application here. So we have our index so far. So if we want to make a request to our index action, that's going to be, it's always going to be a GET request, right? And it's going to be, in this case, we are in our animals controller. It's going to be just /animals. What other actions do we need here, and what are our like HTTP verbs and our let's start with like, what other actions do we have here? Should we add in our controller?
Show,
Show.
for sure.
Okay. What else?
Create and update.
And we're assuming we're giving kind of free reign to our API then, if we're allowing people to put in their own data?
Can you explain that a little bit?
Isn't for the create and the update, we'd be giving an end user access then say, hey, you can put something into this API?
Yeah, so at this point, we haven't added any kind of authentication or anything like that. So yes, hypothetically, anybody would be able to add anything. We are going to eventually add precautions so that that's not possible. So we'll eventually have authentication. We'll specify, you know, which users could change what. This is just like more of like an open kind of thing. Okay. But yeah, that might not be a good idea to just have it be open like that. That's a good point.
Yeah. Okay.
Do we have more actions here?
Delete.
Yeah.
Or destroy.
Destroy. Yeah. Awesome. What about our new and edit? What's up with those?
Don't really need them because we don't need them. We don't need the views.
Yes. So new and edit, remember, they used to be in order to like show our pages, show our new page, show our edit page. They are now handled by our JavaScript HTML front end. We do not need to add this in here because we're not rendering our views anymore. Any questions about this and the fact that we don't need these two and that we have all of this is pretty much our fulfills our like CRUD actions? Okay. So in addition to that, we usually have like our animal params, right? Let's go ahead and create those as well. Params that require. We got our animal. And then let's see, what do we have? Name, gender, and species. Okay, so let's actually build out our actions at this point. We're gonna have a show. Show's gonna be pretty straightforward, right? We're gonna actually do something really similar to what we did up here. We're gonna have our animal, single animal, and then we have to make sure that we find that animal by our params ID. And then we want to render our JSON again for that particular animal. We could test this out if we go to our animal / let's do 2, and this gives us a single animal. So at this point, again, we're building this like API backend. It is going to completely replace our JSON server that we were previously running. We have, with the JSON server, we're really just building like a simple backend. With this, we have a lot more control over our backend and what we want to be able to do. We can add authentication, all that stuff, which we would not be able to do with the JSON server. Okay, so our create is supposed to like create a new animal, right? what do we have to do? What do we need to do in order to like create a new animal?
Link to the front end of a new page, equivalent of the new page.
So we're not, we're gonna like send a response back with the new animal that we hopefully created. But first we have to like actually create this new animal, right? Well, how would we do that? If we were just in the Rails console, how would we create a new animal?
Animal.new.
Create.
Animal gets animal.new.
Yeah, exactly. Animal.new, animal.create. And then we need, what do we need here? A name.
Question. Okay, params.
Yeah.
I was going to say, so in this case, because the first thing I was going to say was set this up to be able to receive a JSON object from the post request, which I don't know.
Yeah, so we'll actually try this out with our application here, Insomnia, without even having like the front end built out. So we're going to send some information to our backend. So let's say animal equals animal.new with our animal params. And then I guess let's make this like species ID. We might have to play around with that a little bit depending on what our front end is actually doing. But at this point, we want to check like, can our animal actually be saved, right? If our animal is able to be saved, we'll render that animal back. And then otherwise, let's go ahead and render like maybe an error message or something. So we'll say render a JSON, and then we'll just kind of create our own response, call this error, and we'll just say something went wrong. You might be able to be a little more specific, but that will do for now. Okay,
Is
so
it possible to,
yeah.
oh, sorry. Is it possible to change the status code on a response?
Absolutely, yeah. You just add a status of 200.
Oh, geez. That's so cool.
Yeah.
Okay, awesome.
Yeah, we'll just we'll ignore that for now, but we can play around with that a little bit if we would like. Okay, so let's try out our create. First of all, let's finish up our, like for our index, we had to make a get to /animals. What would we have to do for our show? What HTTP verb are we using? What URL are we using?
Get /animals/ID.
Exactly. Perfect. What about our create?
Post for animals
Post.
ID.
Post animals. Do we need the ID here if we're creating a
No.
new animal? Right.
Adding
Only
to
need the ID. Yeah, if we're like targeting like one particular animal. Awesome. How about our update?
Patch animals ID.
Patch animals ID. Very nice. And destroy.
Delete animals ID.
Perfect. All right. So now that we got that figured out, we know that we have to make a post request to /animals in order to create a new animal. Let's go ahead and jump back to Insomnia. We're not going to be able to do this like just in our browser without actually building out the front end. So we're going to use this tool here in order to make our request. So if we want to create a new animal, we have to switch our method here to post. We're still posting to /animals, so that's still correct. And we have to specify the data that we want to send, right? So first up, we need our top level key of animal. This is, this essentially corresponds to, let's take a look, our like require part, right? This is, we're requiring the animal. And then within that, we have all of our other attributes like name, gender, species, ID. So within our animal key points to another object. that has all of these attributes. So what do we have? Name. Do Bob. Do we have a Bob already? No. Yeah, we do. Can't think of any others.
Arthur.
Arthur, perfect. Okay, gender. It's gonna be, Arthur's gonna be female, because why not? And then we have our species ID. I don't remember which one's which. Let's just do one. And that is looking good. I think we got everything in there. Remember, if you are writing, if you're actually sending JSON data, you need to have your quotes. That's the syntax for JSON. This is not a JavaScript object. This is a JSON string, really, that we're creating here. All right, so let's double check. We're making a post to /animals. Let's send our animal. And we have gotten a response back already. That was pretty quick. Our response was that we've successfully created this new animal. Notice that we have an ID on there. We have created at, we have updated at. Our request successfully went through. Our Rails backend gave us a response with the newly created animal, and we are happy. Any questions about this?
So once you post, it changes the view inside of the Insomnia for just the one that you update?
Yeah, so this is the response actually that we're getting from the backend, right? So if we're creating something new, then this is the response bot. This is what we are sending back right here, this new animal. So that's what we see then in our response. Let's create an error. So I want to be able to get to this response right here, having an error. If we're not able to save the animal, let's add a validation here. Validates. Let's do like a presence, name. What do we have? Name, presence, true. Right, so we need to have a name for an animal in order to create it. So if we jump back to Insomnia, we'll remove a name and we try to create another animal, we are actually getting our error back because our database was not able to save that animal. Questions
And this is
about this?
actually saving it in the database when we do this right now too?
That's correct. If we jump to our Rails console and we look at our animal.all, we have our last animal in here that we just created. You can also go to /animals and check out this last one here. So that was successfully added. The last request we made wasn't successful because we didn't have a name for the animal, but the previous one was. Yeah, this is all saving it in the database because we told it to, right? We told it to save. If we didn't, it wouldn't save. So we can also, we can say like, let's not save anything and let's just kind of see what happens, right? So we're just creating like a new animal and then we're rendering the JSON for that. Let's do one without a name. So everything goes through. This is not saved in our database, but we're still getting the response back. No ID will tell you this hasn't been saved in the database. Created at, updated at is not filled out. This is literally just that that instance that we created, the instance of an animal that we created. It doesn't actually save it in the database unless we tell it to. So let's bring that back. Okay. Any other questions here? All right, let's build out the rest real quick. So we have our update and our destroy still to do. If we want to update an animal, how might we do that?
animal equal to animal find by ID. Invite.
Yes. Animal dot find. We can do a find by, or we can do a find. And then where do we get the ID from?
The params.
The params.
Params. Exactly. Cool. If we want to update the animal, what do we need to do?
Animal dot update. I think you can. Is there an update attributes method?
I'm not sure. Might be. We'll stick with the update for now, but there might be like an update attributes, and I will just like pass in our animal params. Oops.
Great.
And we could do a similar thing here that we did earlier. We can say, hey, if this actually saves, then send one thing back. Otherwise, send back an error. Let's just do the same error here. All right, and then otherwise we'll render our animal. Awesome. And then the destroy, how do I code out the destroy?
Animal equals animal dot find params ID, and then animal dot destroy all.
Animal dot destroy all. We only want to destroy one, right?
Oh,
But yeah,
yeah.
if you wanted to make a request to destroy one animal and they're all gone, that would be.
Yeah.
No, it's I'm just messing around. Cool, and then we want to probably render something again, right? We could render our animal. We could also render like a message saying successfully deleted animal. Right, this is kind of up to you, like what kind of response do you want to send here? Okay, let's try this out. So we'll try out our update and our destroy. For our update, what kind of request are we going to need to send here?
Hatch.
Hatch. Which URL do I need?
Slash ID.
Slash 1, 2, 3. I think we have like 5. Let's get rid of our last one here. Slash 5. Okay. Do I need something in the body?
You need the body and the animal key, just like you've got there, and then whatever attributes you're changing.
Yeah, so let's do another name here. I think we should be able to like omit all of this. Let's just change the name. Let's try this out. And we will send this. And we're getting an update could not be found. Let's check that out. Did I spell something wrong? Update.
It's DNP are switched in def update.
Ah, thank you. Okay, cool. Let's try that again. Here we go. Cool. All right, so we can double check this again. If we like take a look at all of our animals, we can see that just the name was changed here. We successfully updated the name of the animal in that case. Beautiful. Let's do a destroy as the last one. We can just look at what we determined should be the endpoint and the HTTP request here. Or we can figure it out again ourselves. So make sure that you change the HTTP request, the HTTP verb, and the URL can be the same, right? /5. We'll just get rid of the last one. Do I need anything in the body here?
No.
See a lot of people shaking their heads. I don't need anything. I'm not sending any information. If if you remember, like making, fetch delete requests, you wouldn't send anything besides the method of delete and the ID of the animal in your URL. So let's try that. And we get a message successfully deleted. Let's make a GET request to all of our animals to make sure. And we now only have 4 animals. Cool. Success. So we pretty much built out like a functional backend, functional API, Rails API. At this point, all we need to do is we need to hook it up to our front end. And the way that we would do that is by communicating with our backend via fetch requests. So let's close all of this. Let's jump over to our front end. And we already have code in here, so a lot of this is already written. We can take a look at it if you all would like. I'm gonna exit out of this. But pretty much what we have is we got our base URL right here. We need to change that actually because this is not quite right. Manual v1 API v1/animals. And then we have like a DOM content loaded listener here. Let's also open up our console. That's always a good idea. There we go. And we get, first thing we get is a big fat error. All right, so I'm gonna refresh the page again. I'm making a couple of fetch requests here, right? So we have our listen to form submit, which listens to the submit here. Our render animals down here actually makes a fetch request. So fetch animals is right here to our backend. Why do you all think that I'm getting this error right here? Does someone know what this is all about? It's a CORS error.
Cross-origin request security? I don't know what the S stands for.
Almost. Cross-origin. Yeah, we have to enable that. So it's stands for cross-origin resource sharing.
Resource sharing.
So what that means is we are not by default allowed to, and this is actually something that's enforced by browsers, we're not by default allowed to share resources across different domains. So we have, we're not actually running a server here. We just open our index.html, but imagine this is like our domain, right? Our front-end domain. We have our back-end domain. It is not the same thing as our front-end domain. So what that means is that whenever we're making a request from the front end to the back end, we need to make sure that we actually allow for this request to happen, that we allow for resources to be shared across origins, cross-origin resource sharing. We're trying to share resources across origins. Origins are just like the URLs that we have. So in order to make that happen, we need to go back into our backend, because our backend is actually what determines which URLs or which origins are allowed to make these kinds of requests. And the way that we do that is, first of all, we jump to our gem file and we search for CORS. There is a gem called rack CORS. Rack CORS will allow us to set up these kinds of permissions in order for the front end to be able to make a successful request to the backend. So this is always in there already when you create your Rails application. All you have to do is comment it back in. It's just always commented out. And then obviously we should run a bundle install because we added a new gem. And then what we have to do is we have to search for a CORS file, which should be in your config, initializers, CORS. This file right here will actually determine which URLs, which domains are allowed to access information from this backend. All you need to do here is comment this block of code back in. It also makes sure that you restart your server at that point. It even tells you that. Comment the code back in. This is already given to you, right? All you have to do is comment it in. and change the origins that are allowed to make a request to your backend. And I'm just going to change it to a wildcard, which means right now anybody can access it, any origin, any domain can access information from this backend. Eventually, once we go to production, we might want to make this a little more specific, right? But at this point, we don't have a particular domain yet. So we're just going to make it all of them. Plus, we're local at this point, so we don't really care that much anyway. Okay, so let's review this one more time. Cross-origin resource sharing. Can someone like recap what that means? What does cross-origin resource sharing mean?
When one URL is making a request to a different domain of a different URL and wants that information back.
Mm-hmm. Yep, exactly. So we determine essentially like what front ends are able to make requests to what backends, right? If the backend is the one that makes these rules. So that's why we changed this in our Rails backend, right? So the backend says, hey, I only accept requests from google.com, right? So at this point, only google.com can make requests to my backend. No one else. Everybody else will just get an error and they won't be able to get anything. But if google.com comes and is like, hey, give me all of the animals, I'll be like, yep, sure. I got you in my list of allowed domains. Go ahead and have all these animals, right? In this case, we're just saying like, go ahead and allow everything. So again, cross-origin resource sharing determines like which front ends can talk to which backends. And if we were in person, I like to do this thing where like half the classes, like half the class are front ends, half the class are backends, and then the backends will behind them on the board will write like a domain that they allow, and then the front ends all have domains, right? So you got like Facebook, you got Twitter, and the front ends will walk up to the backends and will ask for information. But only if the backends have written down that particular domain can the front end actually get information. Otherwise, they'll have to leave again. So imagine that. I don't know if that makes more sense, but are there any questions about CORS and what that means, what cross-origin resource sharing is?
I'm trying to get my brain around the implications of that. So there's two things. One, you've got the actual JavaScript being executed on the Zookeeper domain, basically executing the fetch request. Then you've got somebody going into their console and executing a fetch request from that domain. But then you've also got Insomnia, and Insomnia, like when we were sending the requests from Insomnia, it wasn't pinging anything about CORS. So I'm like, I just noticed those things, and I'm like, I'm just trying to get my brain around the implications of all of it.
Yeah, that's a great point. So we've so far made requests like 3 different ways, right? One is actually going to the URL/animals. The reason that this works is because we are making a request on the same domain, right? Localhost 3000, this is where our data lives. This is where we're making the request. Like we're not making it from a different domain. So CORS here isn't an issue. In Insomnia, we are able to make this request because Insomnia is not a browser. Remember that the thing that actually how do I say this? The actor that puts the stop to things, enforces these rules, is the browser. You can actually get, I believe you can get like extensions that kind of go around that. I don't think that's generally like a good idea to do, but you could do that. It's not a good idea to do because once someone else is looking at your application and is trying to use it, right, it's not going to work unless they have that extension. So you have to make sure that you have your CORS rules set up correctly in the backend. So the reason that we're able to get access to that data via Insomnia is because Insomnia or Postman, they're not browsers. browsers like Chrome, Firefox, Safari, they are the ones that are enforcing this. So they're saying, hey, you tried to make a request from one URL, but the backend told me that you don't have access to this. So never mind, you can't get anything, right? So that's the difference there. I hope that kind of answers it.
So that means CORS is a relatively weak authentication?
Well, I wouldn't necessarily say that. So you're,
Topic for another time.
I guess, yeah, I guess like, I see what you mean. Yeah, I'll think about that and see if I have like a good answer for you. Yeah, we're essentially trying to prevent like random front ends from accessing random backends, right? And our backend will still always have the power to determine what front ends can actually have access to it. So if I set this particular origin to like an actual domain, right? Then that means that only that domain is going to be able to access that information. All right. Are there any other questions about CORS?
So origins would be the domain. So like you said, like google.com or like Facebook or something like that. Okay, cool.
Exactly. So in our case, this might be like zookeeper, .com, whatever we have. And we're just gonna allow everything for now. All right, so now if we refresh our front end, we now have access. We have connection refused because I don't have the server running. That makes sense. But we are not getting the CORS error anymore. There's a problem here in our JavaScript, but the request is actually going through. And we are successfully like fetching data. If we look at our network tab right here, we can see that. Pull this up a little bit. Let's just do this. We can see that we are successfully making this request to /animals. We're getting a 200 response back, and we can actually see all of the animals that we're getting back. We just have a bug in our front end here. But other than that, it is all good. Actually, I think this is not a bug, but there's one other thing that I wanted to show you, which is, let's actually look at this. Let's look at this data. Where is it? Right here. Okay, so if we look at this data, we can see that we have all of our animals, right? So we have our animal 1 right here. We got our species ID and so on. What we're doing in our front end at this point is we are fetching all of our animals, resolving that here for each animal. We're iterating. We're taking the body of our, like this is like a little table that we have, taking the body of the table, changing the inner HTML to whatever we return from render animal. And inside of render animal, we are grabbing the animal name, right? Animal.name, gender, so on. And then we're also grabbing the species. We're saying animal.species.name. Now, if we look at the data again, an animal actually, the only thing that an animal has is a species underscore ID. At this point, we don't know what the species name is actually, unless we ask the backend again. So ideally, what I would like is for my backend to to give me the correct data. So for the backend to give me an object or an array of objects that already contains the name of the species. I want to be able to say animal.species.name, right? How do I achieve this? I could do this via serializers. Serializers in our backend determine what our data that we're returning is going to look like. And let's set this up. All right, let me close everything, jump to our backend, and back to our gem file, first of all. And we're going to add another gem that is called Active Model Serializers. See if I spelled that right. I always get that wrong. So the gem Active Model Serializers will allow us to create serializer files. And I'll show you what those do in just a second. There is another gem that you can use here. It is called FastJSON. I believe that you should have both in the curriculum explained. It is totally up to you which one you want to use. In my opinion, the FastJSON API is a lot harder to get going with. The data is nested in a certain way that follows certain rules, but it's just, you know, it's a much larger learning curve in my opinion. So we're just going to stick with active model serializers. The only difference is that if you have a lot of data, the FastJSON API can actually be a lot faster than active model serializers. In our case, we're not going to have a whole lot for the projects that you're building. Also, it's probably not going to make that much of a difference, but feel free to take a look at the differences there. All right, so now that we have our gem, we need to make sure that we bundle install. And at this point, we can create some serializers. We can also do this with a generator. So Rails generator, Rails G serializer. It's a hard word to spell. And then we want a serializer for, what do we have? Animals, animal. And then we can also specify the attributes already that we want to be added. And I'll show you what that looks like in just a second. Let's just do name for now. And let's go to our app. Forget where this is. Serializers. Could not find, oh, sorry, serializers. No, serializer. Should be right. What am I doing wrong here? I guess let's ask for some help. I think I already bundle installed, right? I'm not seeing it.
We might have saved.
Let's try it.
Check into generator.
What's that? Okay, let me check this real quick. I think it's active model serializers. Yeah, that's right. Let's double check. Rails generate serializer animal. Huh.
Try running bundle install again.
Let's do it.
And then let's see if it's, there you go, using active model serializer 0.10.10.
Yeah, it should be good.
Okay. And then Nathan had a good idea. Just try running Rails generator or Rails generate or Rails G on its own.
Oh. I'll just show you all the generators, yeah. I'm not seeing it.
Interesting.
All right, let's do, let's get rid of our gem file lock real quick. Do another bundle install. Take a look at some of this documentation. And all right, let's try this one more time. No. All right, let's put this in our gem file here. Maybe I spelled something wrong. That is the weirdest thing. What is going on? What am I missing? Sorry, everyone. Not sure why this isn't working right now. Active model serializers. Got the gem. I'm in the right folder, right? Let's check that. Yeah. All right. Let's jump to a working version of this because I have that, and then we'll kind of skip over this. Okay, let's see. Oops. All right, let's open this up. Oh, open it up over here. Let's try this again. All right. Cool. So if we check out our gem file, we pretty much did everything else. So this is really just the last step. We have our active model serializers here. Let's run, and I believe we already have a serializer, but let's try running this anyway. Let's go to our backend, of course. Okay, cool. So it tells us like we already have this animal serializer. So let's take a look at that. I'll fix the actual repo like once we're done here so that you have the working code. But it shouldn't take more than adding the gem to your gem file, generating the serializer. Not quite sure why that didn't work out just now. And then it gives you this serializer file. It'll look something like this, right? Not super fancy. And at this point, you can add attributes to your serializer. So we can say, so we already had a couple here. Let's do this. So we can say the attributes that I want to send back whenever someone's making a request for all of my animals or a single animal is the ID, the name, and the gender of the animal. So if we take a look at our /animals again, and obviously run our server. Okay, let's do this. Oh, I forgot that there's actually like a button here. That's pretty neat. Let's make sure we seed. I think we have something in our seed file. Okay, we don't have any animals. All right, let's add some real quick. Sorry about the delay here. Okay. We'll migrate, oh, sorry, wanted to seed. Here we go. And then let's run our server again. Cool. All right, so we have all of our animals here coming back to us. And if we jump into our serializer, so you should find that under app and then serializers here. Get a serializers controller folder. And inside of that, we have our different serializers. In this case, we have an animal serializer where we're determining here the attributes that we want to send back whenever we're making a request. So let's get rid of all of this stuff. And we're just going to send back the name. Sometimes you have to refresh twice if it doesn't save on time. So we are now determining what information exactly we want to send back. In this case, we're just sending the name because the attributes that we specify is just name, right? If we add ID again, it will include the ID now. So serializers will help you format the data that you want to send back on your request, on a request that the front end in our case is making. All you have to do, and this is the cool thing about active model serializers, is that you don't actually have to change anything about your controller. You just have to say render JSON animals, and it will automatically utilize the serializers if they're named correctly without you having to specify anything. One thing about fast JSON API is that is not the same. That's not the case. you actually have to, I think it's something like render JSON, like, you know, serializer.new or something like that, right? It's just a little bit more work to get it going. Feel free to try it out, look at the documentation. In my opinion, like active model serializers are a lot easier to use. So we don't have to change anything in our controller. We just have to actually have a serializer with the correct name. And from there, we can specify the attributes that we want to send back. Now, this is where the cool thing comes in. Let's send the gender as well. We can specify relationships, right? Remember, in our models, our animal belongs to species. We can literally copy this, paste it into our serializer, and what we get is the relationship to that species as a nested attribute. This is like pretty cool in my opinion. This is pretty mind-blowing. So you can, all you have to do in your serializer is tell the serializer what relationship you want to add. This looks exactly like what you would have in a model. So belongs to whatever, or has many, whatever. And it will automatically include that relationship here in your response. And at this point, we can go further. We can say, hey, go ahead, and I really only care about the name of the species. I don't care about the ID. So we're just kind of taking out the ID here, and then we just have the name of the species. So we can just like build our response, like what our response is supposed to look like exactly. Based on that, we can then actually use our front end correctly. Let's see if this works now. So, okay, so if we refresh, we get no error, because now at this point, the response that we're getting looks a little different, which is that we still have an array of objects, but we have a key of species that contains the name of the actual species. So we shape that data to send it back differently, and we're now able to use it accordingly in our front end. Any questions about serializers?
Yeah, I have a question. So we're able to access that species data because when we create the animal, we give that an ID, right?
Yeah.
And then if we do a belongs to species, does that take the place of including the attribute species?
Yeah. So we're because
That's
of
really
the
cool.
other. Yeah, it's really cool, right? Because of the other relationships that we already have set up, and the fact that an animal always belongs to a species. So whenever we created an animal, they would have a relationship to a species. All you have to do is say belongs to in your serializer, and it will automatically include that relationship, depending on also what attributes you have in your species serializer. If you have the ID also in there, it will show that within the relationship.
So then, if you, in the animal serializer, if you include the attributes that have the ID, how does that work? Or wait.
So if we like didn't want the ID for the animal, we could also like do that, and then the ID here is gone. Is that what you mean?
Kind of. I think I just have to look at the code again, but this is really neat.
Okay.
Do other languages have their own version of serializer? I would assume they would.
Yeah, I think so. I haven't played around with it too much, but essentially a serializer is just like, how do you want to shape the data that you're sending back after a request? What do you want it to look like? And the cool thing in this case is like you control both the front end and the back end. So you can shape that however you want to use it in the front end. You can determine that in the back end.
But if you're doing version 1 and you realize that this isn't correct and it's been used, so you want to add it, so you're doing version 2, and version 2 required updating your database pretty substantially, that will impact your version 1 then too, won't it?
Yeah, you'd have to do it in a way that either doesn't directly impact it or create a new database. Yeah. All right, let's do this one more time. In order to add serializers, all we need to do is add our, hypothetically, add our active model serializers to our gem file, do a bundle install, Rails generate serializer for the serializer that we want to create. And then we get our serializers folder here that contains our, in this case, animal serializer. We add the attributes that we want to be able to like send back, that we want to show, and any relationships that we also want to send back. We don't have to do this, right? We can leave this out if all we want is the name and gender and the ID of an animal. But we can add relationships. Same thing with our species serializer. We could say like has many animals, right? So if we go to like /species, I don't know if I have the controller set up. No, we don't. So if we did an index here, let's actually copy this. So if we did an index over here, we would say, what do we have? Species, right? Species dot all. And here we go. Awesome. So we get like our 2 species with all of our animals that are related to that species, that belong to that species. So you can do the relationship however you want. Just remember that, you know, the more you include, the more your database has to be accessed. So if we actually include all of the animals, that is a query that the database has to make. But for now, I would say, like, unless you actually notice like a performance issue, don't worry about that too much. Point being, you can like actually mold your data that you are sending back to the front end. Any other questions?
Complete rabbit hole, but this seems like it would, like, my brain is going like, but what about N+1 queries with the relationships here? Do you know if the serializer goes and makes another request, or can you use includes here?
Yeah, so if you actually are, if you're actually concerned about performance, you should probably switch to the FastJSON API. I don't know exactly what like performance improvements they are making, but it is, if you have large sets of data where you have to access a lot, it's actually quite a bit faster.
Okay.
It's just more of a pain to set up, in my opinion, but you know,
that makes a lot of sense. Okay, thanks for entertaining my brain again.
Yeah. One more thing, you can also, like, what we've used so far here is pre-named serializers, right? So we name them animal, species. You could also create your custom serializers that say you have like a has many animals and you want to use a different serializer for this particular relationship. You could create a custom serializer and then specify that. I don't know off the top of my head the syntax for that, but it should be in the docs. So if you do, you know, you can actually specify the serializer here like so. Yeah, it's possible, but you might have to dig a little deeper. Awesome. I will make sure to fix the repos so that you all have working code.